about a general idea about who some of these people are, but also, more importantly, what their role is in the recreation of the nation of Israel. We talked about last week that verses 1 and 2 begin this list of names. Verse 2, we're given a list of perhaps some of the more important people that return. We spent most of our time talking about Zerubbabel and Joshua, or as it is written in the book of Ezra, Jeshua. Both of those individuals are important, as we talked about how they are connected to what the returnees would begin to assume, begin to look for in hopes of a Messiah. Because for the most part, from this point forward, Israel will be in some type of captivity, even if they are in their own land, until, of course, the temple is destroyed in AD 70. And so we talked about how most of these people are looking for a Messiah that is in the form of both Zerubbabel and Jeshua, who operates both as a king, a political head, and also acts as a religious head through a high priest. We pointed that out in the New Testament. The references to Jesus that come from the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 9, the references of Jesus being a king, as we saw when he enters into the city of Jerusalem in Matthew 21, and then also his role as a high priest, because of how John identifies Jesus as the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world. Again, only a job in which the high priest could remove sins through or at least through the old law, could deal with sins through the Day of Atonement, the sacrifice that was made. Jesus, was a better form of both of those men. As we see the writers of the New Testament point that out. The importance, though, is that the people of Israel at this time look back to the examples of Zerubbabel and Joshua for that inspiration. So if we think about who belongs today in chapter 2, a couple things that we want to keep in mind. Really, one key point that we want to look at as it pertains to this text. What chapter 2 records for us is important because you have the question about who belongs to Israel. Because when the people of Israel return from captivity, from Persia to, essentially what we would think about being Israel, there are obviously already people that live there because of what we see later events in the book of Ezra. And so you have this question about who really belongs here. Who does this land really belong to at this point? Because obviously we're still talking about the people of God. And this is obviously different than our own modern setting, in which we know, of course, God has a different people than the physical, nation of Israel. But at this point, it's still the case. That's still God's people, the physical nation of Israel, as evident by him getting them back. And so there's a huge question that comes up about what do you do with the people that are already there in light of the people who are returning. And what chapter 2 does for us, and what it did for the people at that point in time, is it gives a clear identity of who God's people are and really who belongs to this land, at least at this point in time. Now, obviously, again, today things have changed because the nation of Israel is no longer God's people in that regard. But it obviously causes us to think about the question, if we look at this chapter, do we belong to the people of God? And that'll be a theme that comes up quite frequently in the rest of this book, because of the fact that this is just a list of names, but the application of it comes out later. But that's why these names are important. Obviously it's easy to read over these names because they're hard to pronounce. We don't really know a whole lot about these people. But for the people at the time, this list is important because it gave a clear picture that they belonged with the people of God. And so what we want to do is look at sort of how these names are, at least in part, how some of these names are categorized, and then more so in the latter half of this chapter, the roles that they're going to play in the recreation of the nation of Israel. So we got to keep in mind that this chapter is important because we think about the importance of the land and the people. Again, we think about all the way back in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 12, right, when in essence the people of Judah, or at least the descendants of Abraham are formed, right? We think about the promise given to Abraham. in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Specifically, God's promise to Abram, who later becomes Abraham. Specifically, the promise that from Abram's seed he would make a great nation and that he would give them a land that they would belong to. And this was obviously something that the people of Israel before captivity, pre-exile, had enjoyed. But this is obviously also something that the people that are now post-exile, coming back to Israel, this is a promise that they're going to look back to as a fulfillment of what God had promised to their ancestors. We know that from Genesis chapter 32, verses 37 and 38, right, that these people are given the name Israel because of what the name that God designates to Jacob after he wrestled with an angel, wrestled with God. And so it obviously is important too, because when you think about where the original Israelites lived, remember that the land was divided up in such a way in which it was based on the tribes. If we look at Numbers chapter 33, verses 51 through 56, that passage indicates to us that the land, when the Israelites would settle Canaan, that land would be divided up in large part based on the size of the tribes, right? So tribes with larger populations are going to get a bigger piece of land. Tribes that are smaller in nature get a smaller piece. We can look in the book of Joshua, I believe, in chapters 18 and 19. Both of those chapters point out to us specifically where those regions are. But the importance is that for this group of people that are, again, as we've emphasized, essentially more faithful to God, this is important because part of belonging to the nation of Israel is being able to trace your lineage back to Abraham, or it's also about making sure that you could prove that your ancestors had lived in this region. That is, in essence, how you are going to prove that you are a part, or that at least you should be included as part of this, the recreation of Israel. And so those promises made both for the land and for the people in earlier times in the Old Testament, they're important to those who return, because that's what we're going to see when we break down this text. When we look at verses 3 through verse 20, the true Israel are the returnees, and we know that verses 3 through 20, based on those who could trace their lineage. For the individuals that are identified in verses 3 through 20, again, most of these indications are the people of, and then there's a name after that. That name is a reference to a specific person. And that's important because the people that are essentially included in verses 3 through 20, these are people that could trace their actual physical lineage back to someone who lived in Israel, or at least in what at that point was called Judah. They could trace their lineage to someone who physically resided in that place. And that's why these names in verses 3 through 20 are identified as particular people. This would be in essence, from a genealogical perspective, the most important distinction. If you could trace your lineage back to a specific person, in essence, there was 0% doubt that you were truly part of Israel, because you could prove that your ancestors, you could prove you were connected to your ancestors who had obviously dwelt in the land. Now, the significance of this, when you think about in the New Testament, is obviously when you get to that point, we know, of course, that for a lot of the Jews, the highest distinction you could get is if you could prove your lineage, your physical lineage, back to Abraham. And one of the biggest hurdles or hiccups to doing that is for those people to be able to trace their lineage back to the people who lived in Judah before the exile. That was one of the most difficult steps to accomplish, because again, you had that 70-year gap where the people of Israel were living in captivity. So in Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 5, what individual talks about the fact that he was of the tribe of Benjamin, that he was a Hebrew of the Hebrew? Paul, right? So when the Apostle Paul in Philippians 3, verses 4 through 5 is talking about the fact that as a Jew, that he was in essence better than the other Jews because he was a Hebrew of the Hebrew, because he was of the tribe of Benjamin. What he's saying there is essentially that he fits in with this group of people that are mentioned in verses 3 through 20. So in essence, Paul's ancestors could directly trace their lineage back before the exile. And that gives a reputation by the time that we get to the New Testament that you are the purest of pure Jews in that sense, because you had the ability to do that. And so when Paul is talking about that in Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 5, he's talking about that from the perspective that he would fit within this group of people mentioned in verses 3 through 20. Because he could physically trace his lineage back to Abraham, he could essentially get over this huge hurdle that was an obstacle for other Jews who could not trace their lineage all the way back to Abraham, because they could not trace it back to the time before the captivity. So that's the group of people mentioned in verses 3 through 20. May not mean a whole lot for us, but especially for the Jews in the New Testament, this is a huge, important aspect of it. It was important to the Apostle Paul before, obviously, he converted. Those are the people mentioned in verses 3 through 20. Those mentioned in 21 through 35. Notice that verse 21, instead of talking about a person, it says the people of Bethlehem. And so what we read, verses 21 through 35, is going to be individuals who could not connect their bloodlines back to an ancestor, but they could prove that their ancestors had lived in these cities. Most of these cities are placed in the tribe of Benjamin. Some of them are placed in Judah. As we've already talked about in Ezra chapter 1, most of the people that return are of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin and Levi. And so if you could prove that your ancestors had lived in this land before captivity, that also made you part of what was the true Israel. Now, in Jeremiah chapter 32, this is an event that takes place before the captivity, but God had commanded Jeremiah to do what? If we remember, and Jeremiah is maybe a little bit more obscure, but in Jeremiah chapter 32, what did God command Jeremiah to go buy? He commanded Jeremiah to go buy a field, and specifically, where was that field located? Anathoth, right? And the whole reason why God commanded Jeremiah to buy that land was because Jeremiah had already prophesied that the people were going into captivity. But as a result of that, God had also already said that one day the people would return. And God's promise, or God's sign that they would return, was evident by Jeremiah fulfilling God's command to go buy a field in Anathoth, right? Which proved ownership of the land. It proved that someone had lived on that land, which would then mean that for someone who returned that perhaps had a deed to a land from their ancestors, that proved that they belonged in the true nation of Israel. Now, what do you notice about verse 23? What city, village is mentioned there? Right? Verse 23 tells us that of the group of people who perhaps could not trace their direct bloodline back to someone before the captivity, verse 23 mentions that there were people from the city of Anathoth that could at least prove that their ancestors had dwelt in that city. That made them a part of the true nation of Israel. And so those are the differences between the distinctions in verses 3 through 35. Some could trace their lineage directly back to a physical ancestor. That was important for the Apostle Paul. But for others who could not do that, they could at least trace their lineage, or they at least could trace back to the fact that their ancestors at one point had owned or lived on the land that made up what becomes this new nation of Israel. And so then they are truly part of this new nation, as evident by God's promise through Jeremiah's action in Jeremiah chapter 32. And so identity is then important. It becomes important in the New Testament, but that's why these names in verses 2 through 35, the people of these cities, that's why it's important, because this is all about proving their identity and that they truly belong to this nation of Israel. And these again being primarily from Judah and Benjamin. Because in verses 36, almost through the entire end of the chapter, you're going to look at those of Levi and the distinct roles that they play. And so those in verses 3 through 35, they could accurately testify that they inherit the same promise that God gave to their ancestors back in Deuteronomy 28, 11 through 12, where again, that's the promise that God made, that if they would be faithful, that they would benefit from the land, that it would be fruitful for them. That was given to the people of God. That was given to the people of Israel. These are people that fit, that inherit that same promise. That's why their names. That's why their names are important for the people in Ezra's day. Again, there's not a whole lot more to go into detail about that, specifically because we just don't have a lot of detail about their names. But hopefully that gives us an idea of understanding why these names are important, because it's easy to gloss over them. All right, in verses 36 through 58, you come to the next major section of this chapter, and the names mentioned here are in some way connected to service in the temple. And again, this is broken down into different categories. Some of these categories we'll talk about in more detail than others. We're going to call this the temple personnel, because not all of these people are going to be of the tribe of Levi, even though they have a role to play within the temple. So let's start with the priests. We notice in verse 36 that the priests are, that the first group of people mentioned are the priests. If we go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 24, we notice that David had organized 24 different priestly families to serve in the worship of God. But in verse 36, how many of those families remain?
973.
Well, the families, not necessarily all the individuals in the families. Yeah, Ezra 2:36 down through verse 38. Or verse 39. Yeah, there are 4 families that are left. If you go back to 1 Chronicles 24, that chapter talks about how David organizes basically the priestly families to serve in the worship of the future temple at that point. And that was in part due to the fact that the priests, from my understanding, had a 24-week service period where they would alternate and swap out, which is why there were 24 priestly families. You notice here, though, that only 4 of them remain. And obviously that perhaps is part of the punishment of captivity, perhaps. Perhaps that is just over the course of time that some of those families simply dwindled out, as we talked about in 1st and 2nd Kings. There's a lot of persecution leveled at the people of God, and obviously at these families. Only 4 of these return. Of note, of these priestly families, you see in verse 38, it talks about the sons of Pashur. they're notable to us because this is the family of priests that had actually actively opposed Jeremiah back in Jeremiah chapter 20. Obviously these are also going to be people that descend from, the tribe of Levi, but of those that are significant, if you read Jeremiah chapter 20, the priests that opposed Jeremiah, they are of the family of Pashur, who ironically are some of these individuals who later return and essentially return under the idea of trying to be faithful to God. So perhaps that's the case of, the sons of Pashur learning from the mistakes of their ancestors as they had rejected the message that Jeremiah had preached about captivity. And we kind of know what the priests do. We have an idea of what they do. We notice in verse 40 that it talks about that the Levites also return. The Levites were a group of people that, yes, are of the tribe of Levi, but they don't have the status of the priesthood. In other words, they're going to carry out what we would consider to be the menial or what many would think to be the small or irrelevant tasks that the priest would command them to carry out. If we look at Ezekiel 44 for a minute, and I have a lot of these passages up here for reference sake. This is a passage that I want to look at for a minute. But Ezekiel chapter 44, Ezekiel is given a vision by the Lord, and he talks about the role of the Levites in their role in the temple that would be rebuilt, as we'll see later on under Zerubbabel in chapter 3. But notice that in verse 10, God tells Ezekiel, and the Levites who went far from me, when Israel went astray, who strayed away from me after their idols, they shall bear their iniquity. Yet they shall be ministers in my sanctuary, as gatekeepers of the house and ministers of the house. They shall slay the burnt offering and the sacrifice for the people, and they shall stand before them to minister to them. Because they minister to them before their idols, and cause the house of Israel to fall into iniquity, therefore I have raised my hand in an oath against them, says the Lord God, that they shall bear their iniquity. They shall not come near me to minister to me as priests, nor come near any of my holy things, nor into the most holy place. But they shall bear their shame and their abominations which they have committed. Nevertheless, I will make them keep charge of the temple for all its work and for all that has to be done in it. And so, connecting that passage to Ezra chapter 2, that gives us an indication that these people mentioned in verse 40, that their sole job is to carry out whatever task the priests tell them to do so. Again, whether that is butchering an animal, which obviously would not be a very pleasant thing to experience, obviously a very bloody thing to have to deal with. You wouldn't necessarily want to have to do that job. But basically, that's what the Levites are, that's what this group of people are going to do in the temple. They are of the tribe of Levi, but because of their role leading the people to iniquity, as Ezekiel 44 said, their role then is essentially that they have to do whatever the priest said. That's sort of their punishment that they have to bear when they return to Jerusalem. And so that's what the Levites do. They are essentially of the tribe of Levi, but they are the servants to the priests, and that's because God has put them in that position for their own iniquity. So you got the priests, you got the Levites. Notice that you've also got the singers, verse 41. And in verse 41, what do we know about this group of people who are the sons of Asaph? What do we know about their ancestor, Asaph? Yeah, Asaph. This is an individual that lived during the time of David, who also wrote at least 12 from my count, wrote at least 12 of the Psalms that we find in the book of Psalms. Again, he was an individual strongly and closely connected to David, and evident by the fact that he wrote 12 Psalms. I think is a clear picture of that, considering that David himself also wrote a lot of the Psalms. We know that during the time of David, that when the worship, at least within the singing, that would take place in the worship of the Lord, when that would take place, again, 2 Chronicles 5, verses 12 and 13, we read about them being divided up into a group of singers and then those who would play musical instruments in worship. And then obviously we understand that this is a case of, this is a requirement under the law of Moses. This is not necessarily indicative of what God expects with worship today. But when it says the singers here, this would imply not just those who would physically sing, but also those who would be responsible for playing the instruments, as is indicated by what David had set up in 2 Chronicles 5, verses 12 through 13. And so that's what the sons of Asaph did. Probably individuals who are trained in music, makes sense for them to do that. Because again, this is about, this section is about making sure that the people who are righteous, or at least who want to be righteous when they return, that God also has the people in the temple to carry out the proper worship so that they can be righteous. So you've got the singers, you've also got the gatekeepers, verse 42, down through verse 54. These people are identified as the sons of the gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are important. And this is a passage that I want to look at. 2 Chronicles 23 and verse 19. The gatekeepers are important. Their job was to make sure that the temple would remain pure. At least that's one aspect of their job. So look for a moment, 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 19, or 23. 2 Chronicles 23 and verse 19. The role of the gatekeepers in Ezra chapter 2 fits here because it says that he set the gatekeepers at the gates of the house of the Lord so that no one who was in any way unclean should enter. So the responsibility of the gatekeepers was to ensure that the people who worked in the temple followed the process by which they would ritually be pure. Because again, we know that from the Old Testament, when we go back and look at Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, God placed a premium for those who conducted the worship in the temple, or at that point, the worship in the tabernacle, that they had to go through and make sure that they were pure before they carried out their services. The gatekeeper's responsibility then, in Ezra 2, is to make sure that the priests, the Levites, and as we'll talk about in a minute, another group of people, their responsibility was to make sure that they were ritually pure, that they had gone through the process of making themselves clean before any activity took place in the temple. One of the other responsibilities that I do not have up here, which is found in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verses 26 and 27, is that these individuals were also expected to have trust, or were expected to preside over the stores of the temple. So in other words, when people brought their offerings and when they were kept in storage, this could also mean animals as well. Again, when people brought their offerings to the temple, the gatekeepers were responsible for managing all of that. That was also part of their responsibility. That's why they're important in Ezra chapter 2. Again, if you think about going to the temple, these are the people that you would see on the outskirts of the temple, right? These are the people that are enforcing the rules, essentially, of purification. That's what these people do. All right, so you've got the gatekeepers. That's their role in this. You also have a group of people called the temple servants. And I'm mistaken, the gatekeepers are verse 42. Verse 43, I believe, is the temple servants. So these people are going to be individuals who are not of the tribe of Levi, yet they still help out with the service of the temple. Now, their identity is not very clear. And this may be a place where we may stop here. We didn't get, not necessarily getting as far as I thought we might, but their identity is not clear. Obviously, it talks about who their ancestors are, but when it comes to where their ancestors belong, that's what's not clear. So in Joshua chapter 9, verses 21 through 23, and I want to look at that passage because this is something that we have not talked about, I don't believe, in this class at this point. But in Joshua chapter 9, we read about a group of people called the Gibeonites who lived in the land of Canaan and basically had tricked the Israelites into thinking that they were not a part of the group of people that God had commanded to be wiped out. And so how God dealt with that decision is that he made this group of people, the Gibeonites, to be the servants of the people of Israel. And so let's begin in verse 19. Notice that it says, "Then all the rulers said to all the congregation, 'We have sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. Now therefore we may not touch them.'" Talking about the Gibeonites. "This we will do to them. We will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swore to them." And the rulers said to them, "Let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers for all the congregation, as the rulers had promised them." Then Joshua called for them, and he spoke to them, saying, "Why have you deceived us, saying, 'We are very far from you,' when you dwell near us? Now therefore you are cursed, and none of you shall be freed from being slaves, woodcutters and water carriers," notice, "for the house of my God." Now, the temple did not exist at this point, but some seem to think that this group of people, which if you've got the New King James Version, Ezra chapter 2, verse 43 calls them the Nethinim. But that's perhaps the identity of who these people are. These are the individuals who are the descendants of the Gibeonites who were ordered to carry out the task of things like cutting wood, carrying water, to help out with the worship of God. And that would be their identity. Now, Ezra chapter 8 and verse 20 also talks about David organizing a group of people that perhaps are these people to help out with the Levites and the priests. That could also be their identity. But the point is that these are not people of the tribe of Levi. They're not priests. Yet they still had a role to play in the worship of God. That's why they're a part of this temple personnel, and why they're included here. Again, the gatekeeper would be responsible for making sure that also these individuals are also ritually pure. Even though for us, from our perspective, their identity is not quite so clear. We're also told we've got the servants of Solomon. And tell you what, we're just going to go ahead and stop here because it's already 9:41. We'll pick up in verse 55 next week and obviously finish the chapter and then get into chapter 3. But thank you for your time and your attention. Again, we'll come back to this question in the application of who belongs in that regard.